Adaptogens. Kind of sounds like I should be cruising around in like a Volkswagen bus with long hair talking about adaptogens. Like that's kind of like, it feels like, right? It's an adaptogen. Well, in reality, adaptogens are more than just some hippy-dippy weird stuff. Like they're actually heavily researched, they're pretty cool, and they're starting to be a little bit more cutting edge in the way of like performance research, like we're seeing that applied. But I thought if adaptogens help you adapt to a stressor, like exercise, then how do they affect you when you adapt to a stressor such as fasting? Let's dive in. If you are in a weight loss journey right now, it does get a little bit easier with things that are available. I put a link down below, by the way. I wish that I had something like Thrive Market. You might be thinking, this is contrived. How do you put an ad in this? Well, someone's got to pay the bills, speaking of things being expensive. But there is a link down below for Thrive Market. So like keto, fasting, all kinds of groceries that you want to get delivered to your doorstep that are less expensive than the grocery store, generally speaking, you can get. And there is a link for 25% off of a membership, as well as also being able to get a free gift when you use that link. And a big shout out and thank you to Thrive Market, because they continue to allow me to create this content. They continue to support this channel so employees can be fed, so people can have a good life, so that we can do what we do and help people. And I am indebted to them because of that. So please do check them out. There's a link down below in the description. Thank you guys. So an adaptogen is a compound that allows you to sort of reestablish heterostasis or homeostasis. So you're like kind of finding a new homeostasis and having this fluctuation in your baseline. Now what I mean by that is when we have a stress response, there is something called the general adaptation system, which was coined back in like the 1950s. And that general adaptation system is where we have a stressor and we have the first phase of response, which is like the stress response, where we have adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol, all these things like upregulate really quick as a response to stress. Then we have what's called the resistance phase. The resistance phase is where we sort of come down from that stress response a little bit, and we find a new balance and potentially a new baseline and homeostasis. We resolve the problem, really, or at least we adapt to the stressor. Right? If we had like some crazy chronic stressor coming at us, eventually we're going to kind of adapt to it. We're not just going to remain in crazy fight or flight forever. Then we have phase 3, which is really what we don't want to end up in. That's the exhaustion phase. That's if we get so stressed out for something that we can't even adapt and we can't even modulate and meet that resistance phase, and we become so stressed out that causes a problem. Well, fasting is a stressor. And we are typically sitting in that acute kind of phase 1 stressor during a fast. And then after we eat, we have some phase of phase 2 that comes in, like a little bit of the resistance where we actually meet that and we adapt. That's why we can adjust to the stress response of fasting over time. We start with a 16-hour fast, we get good at that. We adjust to an 18-hour fast, a 20-hour fast, and then sometimes we build all the way up to really long 5-7 day fasts if you want to. The point is you're developing the ability to tolerate that stressor. Well, when you look at the data with adaptogens, nothing is looking at it with fasting, but it's paralleling a lot of that same kind of thing. The idea of an adaptogen is to help assist you in meeting that resistance a little bit faster, meeting that phase 2 and not getting to exhaustion. For example, let me show you a figure on the screen right now, and I've showed this in other videos before. Like this blue line that is on the screen indicates where you are when you are like just normally responding to a stressor. So you see kind of the acute response, and then you kind of get the attenuation of it, and then it kind of, you find your go back to baseline. Well, the purple line indicates what it's like with adaptogens, right? So adaptogens are going to sort of, you're still having that acute response, but then the attenuation is a little bit better. You respond to that stressor better, and you end up kind of balancing and ending up at a lower level of stress. And then what's really interesting is at the end of, like if you look at the far right of the graph, you'll actually see that the purple line ends up at a higher baseline than the blue line after the stressor, meaning the purple line is actually adjusting to the stress. The adaptogens are allowing the baseline to increase so that your threshold for stress in the beginning is better. So you basically need more stimulus to get stressed. I mean, I don't know about you, but that sounds really awesome to me. Okay, then we have to look at a really interesting study. This is one study out of like lots that really clearly shows like how adaptogens work. And it's a mice study, but it still paints the picture. So this study was published in the journal Phytomedicine, and it looked at a combination of 3 different adaptogens that you've probably heard of before. Okay, Eulerococcus, rhodiola rosea, and something called Schizandra. Okay, so in this case, they gave these to mice, okay? And they had them do forced swimming, which again, I've talked about in a video. It sounds kind of messed up. Basically, they forced them to swim. And the control setting, the control mice that didn't have any of the adaptogens in place at all, they swam for 3 minutes before they were exhausted and couldn't swim anymore. Get this, the mice that had the adaptogens swam for 22 freaking minutes. That is insane. That sounds like the most elaborate performance enhancer I could ever imagine, right? The thing is that it is allowing them to modulate and adapt to a stressor. They also found that chaperoning had increased. So chaperone proteins like heat shock proteins, HSP170s, which have to do with exposure to high heat. So when we exercise, we have these chaperone proteins that protect our cells from breaking down in a weird fashion, in like a decrepit way. Also, when we sit in a sauna at a very high temperature, we have an elevation of, well, what do you know? Heat shock proteins that protect our cells from that heat and allow us to have an adaptation. That's why I recommend sitting in a sauna at a high temperature. That HSP activation is tremendous. So, okay, wow, that makes sense why it's improving exercise, because it's elevating heat shock proteins and changing that adaptation. So what can that do for fasting? Because when we are fasting, we are elevating our cortisol and we are decreasing our heart rate variability. We're decreasing our HRV, meaning that we are in much more of a sympathetic nervous system activation. So you start thinking at this, you look at like the whole hypothetical scenario. If we are ultra stressed out when we are fasting, in the same way that we are ultra stressed out when we are exercising, the same kind of things that would lower our heart rate variability, well then could adaptogens help? Now, inadvertently, I've been using adaptogens when I fast for probably 2 or 3 years. I vary between high doses of lion's mane, I mess around with high doses of rhodiola, and this is me personally. I am big on mega dosing things because I like to feel the effect if I'm going to mess around with it. And I absolutely notice that I'm able to sort of attenuate my perceived like stress response when I use things like chaga or when I use things like cordyceps during a fast. Lion's mane gets me more of like a mental, I feel fired up mentally, so I'll take 4 or 5 grams of lion's mane and I feel like I definitely am getting sort of the neuroplasticity effects in BDNF, but that's less of an adaptation, whereas with like rhodiola, I feel like I'm calmer during my fast. Now, that being said, you don't want to rely on this, right? Because we want fasting to be a stressor. So if we start using adaptogens while we are fasting, it's allowing us to adapt to a longer fast, but does that make the argument that maybe we are diminishing the benefit? Because a lot of the fat loss benefit from fasting is coming from the hormone-sensitive lipase activation, which runs through beta-adrenergic 3 or beta-3 adrenergic receptor that has to do with cortisol, has to do with adrenaline, noradrenaline, all these catecholamines that are activated. And if your stress response baseline is higher, then that means you're going to just make it so that you have to do longer fasts to get that effect. So adaptogens will come into play in very specific circumstances. Remember, there are 2 things that are happening. There's sort of the positive additive effect of fasting, and what I mean by that is the additive effect of catecholamines being released, like adrenaline and norepinephrine and all that stuff. That additive effect is fat loss stimulating, but the subtract effect, the effect that you get from removing food, is much more the telomere regenerating, telomerase activity, AMPK activation, autophagy, just deprivation of food, right? That's a whole different world. So if you're after fasting for like longevity purposes and things like that, you could make the argument that adaptogens allow you to go longer without food, without chronically high levels of cortisol and potential like visceral fat building and everything like has to do with high levels of cortisol. Because we have high levels of glucocorticoids within our visceral fat, if we're stressed out chronically even during a fast, we could make the argument that you are losing some of the abdomen fat loss effects, like you're losing some of that central adiposity burning effect. So I think if you're just going for longevity, then adding adaptogens into the mix are a great idea. Or if you're just looking to experiment and kind of test things out, because I think at the end of the day, being able to add things into a fast to get different effects are hugely beneficial. So I encourage you to look at some more of the data surrounding adaptogens, look at things like Eulerococcus, look like Rhodiola rosea, look at things like, lion's mane, chaga, any of these adaptogenic kind of mushroom blends that are out there. Pretty interesting. And again, I don't want to tell you exactly how much it takes, so you just need to experiment with yourself and figure out what works for you. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.